Laughter shattered through the hall like crystal breaking against stone. "Hey, you bring another glass of wine!" A woman's voice rang out sharp and sweet like sugar-coated steel. The grand hall of the Langston Hotel froze for half a second, then burst into laughter, the kind of laughter born from people who had long mistaken humiliation for refined entertainment. Crystal glasses trembled in their hands as chandelier light fractured into 1,000 dazzling shards, mirroring the glamour that hid a spreading stain in midair. At the center of it all, Danielle Reed stood still. The woman in the white off-shoulder gown held her untouched wine glass, the light catching her deep brown skin, turning her into a small flame amid a sea of luxury. She didn't respond, didn't frown, didn't move. Only a slow blink, quiet deep, like a storm waiting to break. The crowd stirred uneasily. Some looked down, pretending to text. Others bit their lips to suppress a laughter, afraid their arrogance might spill over their glasses. And beneath the soft hum of strings playing in the corner, something cracked, not glass, but character. The woman who had thrown that insult was Victoria Whitmore, 34 years old, with soft blonde curls, lips red as wine, and eyes cold as gold-plated steel. Beside her stood her father, Charles Whitmore, Senior, 62 chairman of Whitmore and Sons Financial, a man whose walk radiated power and whose smile had made many bend. Next to them, Brandon Whitmore, 27, in a perfect tuxedo, leaned over and whispered, probably a staff member who got lost. "Look, no diamonds. No invitation." Victoria chuckled, raising her glass. "At Langston class speaks for itself." The words slid off her lips like a blade sharpened with contempt. Danielle didn't reply. She inhaled quietly, the scent of sandalwood mixed with fine wine, rich but hollow. Everything here, from the music and lights to the forced smiles, was bought. But respect, she knew, never had a price tag. She lifted her empty glass and looked at her reflection in the crystal, a calm image, steady and unshaken. Yet behind those eyes, an old memory stirred. Memory one at 19, wearing a borrowed dress, she stood outside a scholarship gala. The doorman looked her up and down, then pointed toward the back. "Staff entrance is that way, miss." She stood still, torn between wanting to protest and knowing no words could turn her skin into an acceptable invitation. Memory 2 at 27, during her first presentation to acquire a failing hotel, a man leaned back in his chair and smirked. "You'd be more convincing in a housekeeping uniform." They laughed, and she smiled back. That smile later hardened into the steel that carried her through the brutal years that followed. Back to the present. Inside Langston's glittering hall, Danielle recognized the pattern, the arrogant grins, the words that cut deeper than knives. But this time the stage was hers. Above the platform, a golden banner gleamed, Whitmore Foundation Charity Gala, celebrating the $5 billion merger. No one knew that the person who had signed the final line of that deal was the very woman they were mocking. She looked around, velvet-covered walls, violins playing Clair de Lune, hundreds of guests in lavish attire. They all looked the same, successful, confident, blind to what was happening right before their eyes. A young server passed by, carrying a tray of wine. Her gaze faltered when she saw the scene. That girl, Mia Torres, 22, glanced at Danielle, then at Victoria. Her lips trembled, as if she wanted to speak, but didn't dare. In her eyes, Danielle saw herself, years ago, the girl who saw injustice, but wasn't yet strong enough to confront it. At that moment, Charles Whitmore's voice broke through low and commanding, polished by decades of power. "This area is for invited guests only, young lady. Staff shouldn't be standing in the middle of the hall." Laughter returned dry and mocking. Danielle lowered her glass, her fingers relaxing as if she were shedding a mask. She met Charles's gaze, not directly, but deeply enough to pierce through. She said nothing, only silence, the kind of silence that makes the guilty hear their own heartbeat. Victoria glanced toward the hotel manager, Greg Patterson, 45, a man built on rules and the habit of obedience. "Greg, please escort her out. This event isn't for staff." Greg nodded and started walking each step, heavier than the last. The air thickened like a string about to snap. Danielle turned her wrist slightly. Her phone screen lit up a message from Kayla, her assistant. "Everything's ready. Give the signal when you're set." Danielle smiled softly, not in response, but with the calm of someone who already knows the storm is coming. In a far corner, Ethan Park, a young guest in a grey blazer, sipped his wine and watched. His eyes held no disdain, only suspicion. Something inside him said what he was seeing was wrong, though he couldn't yet name it. He quietly opened his phone camera, ready to record whatever truth was about to unfold. And so, within minutes, the most expensive gala in Chicago turned into a stage of silence and judgment. The music played on, but everyone could feel it. Something had shifted, like a cold wind slipping through layers of velvet and glass. Danielle looked around one last time. She didn't speak. She didn't need to, because she knew that tonight silence would speak louder than any voice. And with just one more breath, those who laughed now would soon be the ones trembling. A storm 10 years in the making was about to break loose right here tonight at the Langston Hotel. In Chicago's high society, there wasn't a single person who hadn't heard the name Whitmore, the family whose mere handshake could make the stock market tremble. From banking and hotels to aviation, their power seeped into every marble tile of the Langstons' grand hall. But tonight, beneath the strings of violins and the shimmer of chandeliers, that same power was revealing its darker side, a power wrapped in the polished veneer of disdain. Charles Whitmore Sr. stood at the center of the ballroom, like a king without a throne. His black tuxedo was flawlessly tailored, a platinum shield-shaped pin gleaming on his lapel, the emblem of untouchable class. Each time he lifted his glass, the light caught it just enough to make the person before him feel smaller. His daughter Victoria was his mirror image sharpened by the modern age, soft golden waves of hair, a red-fitted gown, and the confident smile of someone who had never heard the word no. They didn't need to speak loudly. A single glance was enough to make others retreat. But tonight, among hundreds of guests swaying to La Vie en Rose, performed by the live orchestra, their eyes were fixed on the woman in the white dress, Danielle Reed. "Who is she?" Victoria asked softly, her tone calm but cold. Charles arched a brow. Probably someone from the hotel staff. She shouldn't be standing in the middle of the room like that. Brandon smirked. Or someone trying her luck. Maybe she thinks pretending to be a guest gets her a free dinner. The three of them laughed their laughter, blending with the music as if it were nothing. But people heard. Worse, no one reacted. Because in gatherings like these, silence was the language of complicity. At the far end of the hall, the lights reflected off a glass wall, where the Whitmore Foundation logo shone like a crown. Below it, a glowing LED screen scrolled the words, celebrating the $5 billion merger with Reed International. No one paid attention to the second name. They saw only Whitmore, heard only Whitmore, worshipped only Whitmore. That was why they laughed when Charles laughed, bowed when Victoria smirked, and stayed silent when their words of insult slipped out, light as air, but cold to the bone. Danielle stood there, unmoving at the eye of the storm. She didn't flinch, didn't brace herself. Each breath she took was measured with the calm of someone who had already walked through fire. The chandelier light washed over her dark skin, reflecting a truth few wanted to see. In this world of wealth, skin color was still an invitation for prejudice. In her mind echoed the voice of Kayla, her assistant waiting at the office just a few blocks away from a message she had sent earlier. They'll expose themselves. Just let them talk. Danielle gave a faint nod, as if the words had just arrived from the past. Across the room, Greg Patterson, the Langstons' manager, watched carefully. He was the kind of man who believed rules were the fence that protected reputation. The Whitmore name had built his career, and he couldn't afford to offend them. When Victoria's eyes flicked toward him, a silent order, he understood it was time to act. "Excuse me," Miss Gregg said, as he approached, his tone polite, but carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "This event is for confirmed guests only. I'm afraid I don't see your name on the list." His words drew attention like a spark in dry air. Dozens of eyes turned. The crowd instinctively parted, forming an invisible circle around her. Danielle stood at the center, a figure on trial in a courtroom made of crystal. She looked at Greg, not defiant, only silent. A faint smile touched her lips, thin as a scratch on glass. "And what if I don't present an invitation?" Her voice was soft, yet it carried clearly through the room. Greg hesitated. He wasn't used to questions like that, the kind that made authority stop to think. Brandon chuckled, patting Charles on the shoulder. "Told you she doesn't belong here." Victoria raised her glass, the clink of crystal sharp as ice. "Let's hope she knows how to leave without making a scene." Her words fell just as the orchestra shifted into Moon River, a perfect soundtrack for people who believed the world revolved around them. But within that melody, a single pause appeared. Brief yet enough for everyone to sense something was off. A middle-aged guest frowned slightly. The young waitress Maya froze mid-step, her tray trembling. From across the room, Ethan Park still held his phone, uncertainty in his eyes. He looked at Danielle, then around him. Nobody moved. "Doesn't anyone see it?" he whispered, but his voice was swallowed by the music. Charles took a sip of his wine, his tone calm but commanding. "Greg, do your job. Don't let my event turn into a circus." The word circus dropped like a gavel striking marble. Greg inhaled deeply, turning toward Danielle, but before he could speak, she moved. Slowly, deliberately. Her footsteps echoed across the marble floor, not hurried, not timid, just steady enough that each step sounded like a statement. She placed her wine glass on the nearest table. The sound of crystal meeting wood rang out sharp and cold. Laughter died. "What is she doing?" Victoria whispered, her voice low but edged. No one answered. Danielle looked around, her gaze sweeping over every face, people who had built their confidence on the illusion of being untouchable. In their faces, she saw pieces of her past, the times she was dismissed, pushed out of rooms she had every right to stand in. And tonight, she had returned to measure the weight of silence. A moment passed. Greg still hadn't moved. Charles frowned, about to speak, when a faint click cut through the air. Someone, perhaps Ethan, had taken a photo. Then another flash. More phones lifted. Mia exhaled shakily, her heart pounding, as if she were witnessing something irreversible. Victoria forced a smile. "Everyone, please, it's just a misunderstanding." But no one laughed with her. The room sank into a heavy silence, a silence thick enough to crack the golden smiles of the Whitmore family. In that moment, Danielle wasn't thinking about reputation or wealth. She thought of every person who had been forced into silence because of skin status or bias. She thought of every meeting she'd been kicked out of, even when she was the one who had written the plan. She thought of her father losing his job for defending a colleague who'd been humiliated. And she realized Charles, Victoria, and Brandon weren't just a family. They were the face of a system too accustomed to forgiveness. But tonight, forgiveness was off the table. Charles raised his glass, trying to reclaim the mood, but the violin faltered. One wrong note rippled through the orchestra, throwing the harmony off balance, as if even the instruments could no longer bear the scene. Ethan whispered, "This isn't right." Mia's hands trembled as she clutched her tray. Greg drew in another breath, torn between the power he served and the truth standing before him. Danielle didn't move. The chandelier light glinted off the small silver bracelet at her wrist, a delicate spark that cut like truth itself. In her mind, Kayla's voice returned, calm, steady, unwavering. "You don't need to shout to be heard. Just stand still and let them reveal themselves." Danielle closed her eyes briefly and took one deep breath, a breath preparing for the storm to come. Because tonight, in the grand hall of those who believed they owned the world, the one they mocked would be the one holding the scales. Silence. A thickened kind of silence, no longer the pause between two pieces of music, but the weight of judgment itself. In the Langston Grand Hall, someone coughed softly. Someone shifted in place, yet no one dared to speak. Danielle Reed stood at the center of it all like a rock in the surf, unmoving and resolute. Each breath was slow and deliberate, as if she were counting the seconds, so the other side could sink deeper into its own arrogance. On the table, the crystal wine glass still held the imprint of her fingertips, casting back the blaze of the ceiling lights. And in that instant, people began to understand that she was not afraid, she was watching. She was silent, but her eyes spoke. They said more than any defense ever could. "I have heard this my whole life, but this time, you will be the ones who listen." In a corner of the room, Victoria Whitmore leaned toward her father and lowered her voice. "I do not understand why she has not been removed." "What is Greg doing?" Charles knit his brows, trying to keep his composure even as irritation rose. "Let him handle it. Someone like her is not worth our stooping." Brandon cut in his tone, openly pleased. "Or she is performing, and if she is, she chose the wrong stage." The three of them laughed again, but this time no one joined them. The guests around them began to feel that something was off. Not because they had suddenly grown kinder, but because the fear of being implicated had sobered them. The music slipped off key. The lights seemed to waver. Even the air took on a strange scent, a cold metallic tang that warned of a coming storm. Danielle closed her eyes for a moment, and in that quiet space the memories surged back like daggers made of light. She saw herself at 20, sitting in an old car parked outside a hotel lot in Atlanta. Rain fell without stopping. She had just been denied a booked room because the system could not find her name. She knew it was not the system. It was the front desk clerk who looked at her, judged her, and decided she did not belong. That night, she slept in the car on a seat of freezing leather arms. Wrapped around the project documents, She had spent a year preparing for the first work of her life. At 27, she entered a Boston conference room, carrying the plan for her first hotel chain. 11 white men sat around the table. When she finished presenting, the man in the center with a bald head and a gold watch smirked. "You write very well. I am sure your boss is proud of his secretary." The room burst into laughter. She did not argue. She said, "Fortunately, I do not have a boss." That night, when she closed her office door, she cried not from hurt, but from a promise that she would never let anyone's mocking smile define her worth. A sound from the present pulled her back, the soft slap of Greg Patterson's soles against marble. "Miss, I am sorry, but this is a private event. If you cannot provide an invitation, I will have to." He did not finish because Danielle opened her eyes. One look, only one, and Greg faltered. In those eyes there was no challenge, only something that unsettled him, a power that did not need to raise its voice. She spoke quietly, her tone gentle but weighted. "Are you certain you are doing the right thing?" Greg's mouth opened, but he found no words. 1 second, 2 seconds, he stepped back half a pace. Brandon laughed loudly. "Do not let her spook you, Greg. Do your job." Victoria lifted an eyebrow, her voice sharp. "If she has anything to prove, she can say it. If not, I am sorry, this gala has no place for imposters." But Danielle did not speak. She simply turned slowly and looked toward the orchestra. The violins trembled, thin and fragile. A wrong note rang out. Then everything stopped. No words, no music. Only the breath of hundreds of people, short and quiet, as if each one feared being heard. Far across the room, Ethan Park still held his phone. His fingers shook, but he did not stop. He began recording. Not to play the hero, but because deep down he knew the truth needed to be kept. He whispered, "She is saying nothing, but they are undoing themselves." Mia Torres, the young server, stood near a column, her hands clutching the tray until her knuckles went white. She looked at the woman in white, feeling both fear and admiration. A part of her wanted to shout to defend, but another part understood that silence did not need saving. It was fighting. She had never seen anyone stand before power without bowing like that. Danielle drew a breath. The rose from Victoria's perfume threaded through the air, mixing with wine and hollow laughter. In her mind, another image rose: her father, the man who taught her the first lesson of pride. He had once been an ordinary hotel employee. One day he was fired for defending a colleague who had been insulted. "Do not fear when people belittle you," he said. "Fear when you start believing they are right." Over the years, that sentence became an anchor in every storm of her life. She opened her eyes. The entire room was watching. Greg stared at her. Victoria held her breath. Brandon frowned, and Charles curled a smile, trying to reclaim the upper hand. "Do you know who you are talking to?" he asked, his voice low but hard. Danielle tilted her head so slightly it felt like a breeze. "I do," she said calmly. "But the better question is, do you know who you are talking to?" A silence seemed to drop, shattering the layer of fake confidence in the room. Charles moved to reply, but the words caught in his throat, because, though he could not explain it, he felt himself begin to tremble. From the doorway, a strong gust swept in, tugging at the red velvet drapes. The chandelier light danced across Danielle's face, tracing her in radiance. Ethan lowered his camera, eyes wide. He whispered, "She does not need to say another word. This room already knows who holds the real power." In Danielle's mind, a single clear thought passed: do not let them drag you down. Let your stillness make them see themselves. And so she stayed silent, silent with ferocity. Greg swallowed hard and did not dare take another step. Victoria turned away, trying to hide her unease. Brandon lifted his glass, but his hand shook. Charles clenched his jaw to look composed, yet his gaze had already drifted. With every passing second, Danielle's silence became a blade. The longer it lasted, the deeper it cut through the costume of power. Ethan set his phone down and murmured, "She does not need to speak. Just standing there is enough to make this whole system tremble." Maya kept watching her chest, full of an emotion she could not name. She only knew that tonight she was witnessing a model of wordless strength. Danielle stood her ground, a living reminder that some battles require no shouting, only an unshakable faith in one's worth. And when the light struck her eyes, they burned like heated metal, composed and ready to judge. She did not need to win the argument. She would win the war of truth. The first blow did not come from a shout, but from a brittle laugh. Victoria Whitmore's laugh cut through the hall like a blade, slicing the thick air. "How amusing," she said, voice icy. "Someone thinks she can stand in the middle of a Whitmore family gala without an invitation. Manager, take care of it before people start thinking the Langston Hotel is a place where anyone can stroll around." The tension already tight as a string snapped. What should have been a small misunderstanding became a deliberate public humiliation. Greg Patterson, the hotel manager, swallowed hard. He understood the Whitmore power. They could end decades-long contracts with a single phone call. As for the woman in the white dress, he had never heard her name. He drew a deep breath and stepped forward, his tone stiff. "I am sorry, miss. I am afraid you need to provide your invitation. If not, I will have to ask you to leave this area." Every eye turned to Danielle. She remained composed, so calm, it made those giving orders uneasy. "And if I do not?" she asked, light but firm. Greg faltered. He had not expected her to ask in return. "Then I will have to call security." "Call them," she said, her voice smooth as silk. The hall went still, only the faint clink of crystal in Victoria's hand. She laughed again, dripping with scorn. "Goodness, do you really think you have a choice?" Danielle did not answer. She simply turned her gaze, passing over a guest who tried to avoid her eyes. That man, the chief financial officer of Whitmore Group, stared into his glass. He knew she was right. Even the right to choose had a price, and only some were allowed to buy it. Charles Whitmore Sr. cleared his throat and stepped half a pace forward, his voice low and resonant, like a bronze bell. "Young lady, do not turn this into a play. I have hosted more than 30 galas at the Langston, and not once has someone lost their way and behaved like this. You are disgracing yourself." Danielle looked at him without a flicker. "No, sir," she said, "I am simply letting you display yourself." The words landed clean and sharp. A few guests tilted their heads, startled by the boldness of her tone. What unsettled them more was the steadiness in her delivery. No anger, no defense, only truth, spoken with the certainty of someone who had seen it all. Brandon laughed, a childish and hollow sound. "She is crazy. Victoria, call security. Do not let tonight be ruined." Victoria curled her lip. "What a shame. I hate watching people lower themselves like this." Danielle glanced at them, just for a beat, then turned to Greg. "Are you sure you want to do this right here?" Her voice was even, but each word felt sheathed in steel. Greg blinked. Part of him wanted to end it quickly. Another part felt something like fear. He did not know what he feared, only that this woman's silence made him feel small. Mia Torres, the young server, still stood behind a nearby column. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might be heard. From where she stood, she could see Danielle's hand, clearly not shaking, not clenched open and ready as if to receive anything. Mia had never seen anyone so calm when an entire room turned its back. She swallowed and whispered, "Do not be silent, sister. Say something." At the same moment, the young guest with the phone, Ethan Park, shook his head slightly. No, she knows exactly what she's doing. He lifted his camera higher. The lens captured Victoria's smile, Brandon's sneer, Charles's frown, Greg's confusion, and Danielle standing there straight, steady, proud. Ethan knew the footage would be more than evidence. It would be a symbol. Charles lost patience. He signaled to Greg, his voice tightening. "Do you hear me? Do your job." Greg stepped forward, trying to keep his professionalism. "Miss, if you do not verify your identity, I will have to ask you to—" "You are right," Danielle cut in, soft but crisp. "Identity. You should ask the Whitmore family, who put the first signature on the $5 billion deal they are celebrating tonight." Greg froze. Brandon burst out laughing. "My God, she thinks she is a partner." Victoria shook her head with a bored smile. "People like you always think you are special." Danielle did not respond. She turned the wine glass on the table, leaving a perfect thin circle of water on the glass surface, precise and cold. She spoke slowly, each word falling like a hammer stroke. "You call this a high society party. All I see is a room full of people afraid of losing the right to look down on others." No one moved. A heavy pause stretched long enough that Greg's heartbeat seemed audible. Charles narrowed his eyes, his voice grinding. "Are you accusing us?" Danielle answered softly. "No. I am reminding you to look in a mirror." Wine splashed into a glass. Victoria poured herself a little more, lips pressed tight, trying to appear calm, but her hand trembled. Brandon's face flushed as he lost patience, tapping his glass against the table. "Enough. She has no invitation, no standing. Greg, call security." Greg stepped back half a pace, his eyes wavering. "I think we should wait a moment." "Wait for what?" Victoria snapped. "Do your job." A security guard near the door began to move. Every gaze in the hall focused on Danielle. Time seemed to slow. The lights caught her eyes, and they gleamed like fire. Mia gripped her tray and whispered, "Do not let them do this." Ethan held his phone steady, his heart pounding like a drum. Greg stood at a crossroads between conscience and fear. Charles did not know that at this exact moment, everything was tilting. Danielle slowly set her glass down. The ring of crystal on wood, a clear chime, sounded like an alarm. She did not speak. She did not move. She only looked. That look made people feel as if they had just committed a crime. Miss Gregg said, his voice smaller now. "I do not want to do this. Please cooperate to avoid a misunderstanding." Danielle tilted her head. "A misunderstanding. When someone looks at me and decides I belong below, you call that a misunderstanding." Greg lowered his eyes. He did not answer. He knew there were no words strong enough to cover the truth that had just been exposed. Victoria gave a brittle laugh and lifted her glass. "Come on, everyone, do not overreact. This is just a gala. Let us not turn it into a morality forum." But her voice was no longer sure. It trembled like a string about to snap. Without lowering his camera, Ethan murmured, "This is not a gala anymore. This is a lesson." In that moment, Danielle's fingers brushed her phone, a simple gesture that sent a chill through those who noticed. No one knew what she was doing. No one understood that with a single press, The $5 billion deal they were toasting could evaporate in a second. She looked straight at Charles, her voice low, almost a whisper. "You just called me young lady." "Thank you. From now on, I will remember that." Then she stepped back half a pace, her gaze unbroken. A faint smile touched her lips, not mocking, not triumphant, the quiet smile of someone who already knows the ending. Tonight, the Whitmore family believed they were humiliating a woman. In truth, they were building the stage for their own collapse. No music, no laughter. Only the dry sound of shame rolling slowly across a gilded room. The Langston Grand Hall, once a symbol of power and prestige for Chicago's elite, now felt like a theater of guilt, where every glance quietly exposed something true. At the center, Danielle Reed stood still, a woman insulted and surrounded, yet the only one who did not tremble. Light struck her face and traced the white of her dress until she seemed to glow, while those facing her, the Whitmore family, and the guests who had laughed the loudest, seemed to lose their shape within that same light. Greg Patterson inhaled deeply, trying to swallow the tightness in his throat. He no longer knew whom he was serving, the powerful who were used to giving orders, or the silent woman whose eyes made him feel inexplicably guilty. He tried to speak, his voice thinning. "Miss, if you cooperate, we can avoid an unnecessary misunderstanding." No one answered. There was only the soft chime of glass as a guest set a drink down to hide the discomfort in their chest. In a corner, Victoria Whitmore forced a smile. The gold leaf veneer had cracked. "Come on, everyone," she said, her tone out of rhythm. "This is just a little misunderstanding. Let us not make the atmosphere this heavy." No one responded, not even Charles Whitmore, Senior, the most powerful man in the room, who only stood still, eyes cold. He could not understand how things had slipped out of control so quickly. A woman, without shouting or arguing, had left the entire room without bearings. Far across the hall, the young guest Ethan Park kept filming. His lens caught every detail, the light, the breath, the abashed faces. It felt as if he were recording a trial, with no judge and no jury, only truth standing in the center, while each person quietly sentenced themselves with their eyes. Ethan whispered, "She does not need to say anything. This room is speaking for her." One moment, one breath, then a single look from Danielle froze time. She glanced toward Mia Torres, the young server half hidden behind a column. Mia gripped her tray lips, trembling eyes wide. She knew she was witnessing something unusual, something larger than the fear of losing a job. When Danielle gave the slightest nod, Mia understood that silence can be a way of speaking. She said nothing, but she did not turn away again. In the middle of the hall, Brandon Whitmore broke the air with a mocking laugh. "What is this? Is she trying to hypnotize us with her eyes?" He spoke, but his voice had lost its certainty. His ridicule sounded, but no one joined in. Silence spread like an invisible fire. It swallowed every laugh, every jeer, every confident sound of those in power. Victoria searched the room for agreement. "We are letting an imposter disrupt our party." No reply. Only the guests' eyes. People slowly realizing the joke they thought they were watching had become the most shameful thing of the night. Greg started to signal security, then stopped. His stomach twisted, as if someone were wringing it tight. It was not fear of losing his job. It was fear of being wrong. Fear that if he obeyed, he would be captured by the phones, now pointing their way. He glanced around, and yes, the glow of screens was multiplying. One, then two, then many. Silent witnesses, pulling out their phones, pretending to text while recording history. The sight drained the color from Victoria's face. "Put your phones away," she shouted, her voice slipping its leash. "This is a private event." No one listened. The more she shouted, the more she revealed her desperation. Danielle remained where she was, unmoving. She looked at Victoria without contempt, only understanding, the kind of understanding that leaves the other person feeling exposed. "I am not the one making you lose face," Danielle said softly. "You are doing that yourself." Victoria opened her mouth to answer, and could not. Something caught in her throat, because deep down, she knew it was true. An older woman, Mrs. Caldwell, a long-time donor to the Whitmore Foundation, whispered to her husband, "I cannot believe it. It is as if they are throwing out their own partner." He nodded faintly. "We are witnessing history, just not the kind to be proud of." The whispering spread from one table to two, from a single row of guests to half the room. The power of the crowd began to shift. No longer taking the side of power, it leaned toward truth. Charles Whitmore Sr. felt it. For the first time in years, he could not command the room. He raised his glass, meaning to say something to regain control, but his voice wavered. "Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps this is a misunderstanding. There is no misunderstanding." Danielle cut in her voice, not loud, yet it cracked like thunder. "There are only people too accustomed to insulting others without fearing the consequences." The murmurs died. The room held its breath. Ethan swung his lens from Charles back to Danielle. The light in the frame shifted, no longer bright for the wealthy, but for the dignified. He murmured, "They think they are trying a woman, not realizing they are the ones on trial." Mia stepped out from her hiding place. Her hands shook, but her eyes shone. She said nothing, only took a step and stood there a few paces from Danielle. Their eyes met in silence, a message without words. "Do not be afraid, I am here." Victoria saw it and snapped. "What do you think you are doing? You work for me." Mia did not reply, only bowed her head slightly, and that gesture rippled through the hall, because for the first time, someone from the ranks of obedience had moved toward justice. Charles slammed his glass on the table. "Enough!" He barked, his voice unsteady. "Who are you to dare?" He did not finish, because Danielle turned back, her gaze flashing like a blade. "I am the person you will remember for the rest of your life." A brief smile crossed her lips, low and calm, like a horn sounding the end of a song already out of tune. The room fell utterly silent. No one dared to breathe too hard. Beyond the glass, lightning flared over the Chicago horizon. A white streak split the sky and poured into the hall, and in that light, everyone saw the absolute reversal of the balance of power. The one surrounded was no longer Danielle. It was the Whitmore family people who thought their laughter was a weapon and never imagined it would become evidence of their own cruelty. Danielle did not need to speak again. She simply stood there quietly and let the room unmask itself. Each averted gaze was a confession. Each quickened breath was an apology no one dared to voice, and within that silence, an earthquake began, not in marble underfoot, but in the conscience of every witness. Tonight at the Langston, everyone learned a single truth. You do not need power to make the world tremble. You only need silence, when that silence belongs to the side of justice. The air in the Langston Hall was thick as smoke. Eyes crossed and interlaced into an invisible net of guilt and fear. Everyone could feel it. Something was about to break a limit that a single small action would shatter completely. Then came the cold metallic ring, the sound of a wine glass, set down hard. Charles Whitmore Sr. had done it. His face flushed with anger, part loss of control, part shame. "Enough," he said, his voice heavy. "I will not allow anyone to cause a scene at my gala. Greg, call security now." Greg Patterson stood still, hands trembling, slightly afraid to move. He looked at Danielle, then toward the door, where two security men in black suits hesitated. They were not sure whom to obey. Victoria Whitmore let out a brittle laugh, sour and proud. "This performance has gone on long enough. You have no invitation, no identity. Yet you stand here as if you are the center of the universe." She lifted her glass and pointed at Danielle with a mocking flick of the wrist. "This is why we cannot open our doors to every kind of person. They do not know their place." The words landed like a slap in the middle of the room. A few guests gulped for air. Others drew their shoulders in, avoiding each other's eyes. Ethan Park trained his lens on Victoria lips pressed tight. He knew he was capturing a moment that could never be erased. Danielle still did not answer. She only tilted her head, her eyes shining like mirrors, not anger, but restraint at its most absolute. "Do you truly believe the right to insult others is a privilege of wealth?" Danielle said softly, her tone firm as steel. Victoria faltered, then laughed, her voice pitched high. "I am only speaking the truth. If you feel insulted, perhaps it is because you know you do not belong here." A heavy thud followed Brandon, Whitmore's hand slamming the glass tabletop. "She is challenging us," he shouted, his face flushed, the mix of alcohol and arrogance sharpening the menace in his eyes. He swung to Greg. "What are you waiting for? Throw her out!" Greg opened his mouth and found no words. It felt as if his feet had been nailed to the floor. Then the inevitable happened. Brandon stepped forward, half-full glass in hand, eyes blazing. "Fine," he said with a sneer. "If you are so thirsty, I will help you do your job." He shoved the glass into Danielle's hand. "Here, serve." The wine sloshed a dark red splash across her wrist. The room froze. Every gaze locked on those hands, where red bled across white silk like a wound in a counterfeit paradise. Victoria tittered a sound sharp as shattered glass. At last someone taught her where she truly stands. Greg squeezed his eyes shut. Ethan hissed a curse under his breath, his grip tightening around his phone. And Mia Torres, the young server, was shaking. A small sob caught at her lips, not fear, but fury. Danielle did not move. She looked at the glass in her hand, where the light fractured into blood-red shards. Then, in the silence of hundreds, she set it down. Not hard, not hurried, only a feather-light motion that rang out with a lingering chime. A simple sound that shook the entire room. She said nothing. She only raised her head and looked straight at Brandon. There was no rage in her eyes, only a serenity that frightened. Brandon stepped back half a pace, as if he had touched something forbidden. Victoria kept laughing, but the rhythm had changed. She could feel it, no one was laughing with her. The room went still, as if time had been locked. In that stillness a voice cracked like thunder, small yet resounding. "Do not touch her." People turned. It was Mia Torres. She stood there, her tray fallen to the floor, glass exploding at her feet, wine running like blood over marble. Mia panted, yet did not take back her words. Her eyes burned, brimming with equal parts fear and courage. Brandon spun on her. "What did you say?" "Do not touch her," Mia repeated, small but steady. "Do you know who you are talking to?" Mia pressed her lips together, tears threatening, but her gaze held. "I do. And I also know what is wrong when I see it." The hall held its breath. Victoria shrieked, Greg, throw her out now. Is everyone mad tonight?" Greg stood pale and frozen. He did not dare move, did not dare look at anyone. He knew that if he fired Mia now, the room and the dozens of phones filming would destroy his career forever. Danielle looked at Mia, a thin smile appearing. It was slight, but in her eyes lay gratitude and pride. Then she turned back to face those who had humiliated her. Her voice was low and even rebounding like surf against stone. Sometimes the weakest person in the room is the bravest. Victoria gripped her glass so hard her hand strained. "Are you talking about yourself?" Danielle answered quietly. "No, I am talking about the girl who just saved the honor of all of us." A wave of whispers rose through the crowd. Ethan lowered his camera, eyes bright. He understood the point of no return had arrived. This was no longer a small misunderstanding. It was a public moral verdict, and the ones on trial were the Whitmores. Charles drew a harsh breath, grasping for control. "That is enough. You have caused more than enough trouble. Where is security?" But no one moved. The two guards looked at each other and then lowered their heads. They knew that once these videos spread, no order could cover the truth. Charles barked louder. "I said call the police right now." The command was swallowed by a vast silence, a silence that was no longer fear, but judgment. Danielle closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She heard the quick breaths, the pounding hearts, the drip of wine onto stone. She felt everything, all the anger, the contempt, the hurt, melting into the only strength she needed, calm. She opened her eyes and looked straight at Charles. "You just crossed a line." "What line?" he growled. "The line between a mistake and self-destruction." The words fell softly and cut clean. Ethan caught the moment Danielle framed by a bloom of red wine, her dark hair catching the light, and around her 100 faces drowning in silent regret. She did not shout. She did not threaten. She only looked, and that look made the whole room shudder, as if they had just seen a sentence handed down by a pair of eyes. Outside, thunder cracked. Lightning raked the Chicago sky and poured through the glass, crowning Danielle with the light of justice. She spoke gently to no one in particular. People think power lives in the loudest voice. Sometimes it lives in a silence no one can bear. No one dared breathe. No one dared move. Only one thing was certain. The line had been crossed, and from here there was no way back. No one spoke. No one moved. The air in the Langston Hall was so dense it seemed one could hear the heartbeat of every person, each pulse off rhythm. In that moment, time itself felt suspended, as if every beam of light from the chandeliers, every note from the violins, every breath of pride had been drawn into the silent space where the woman in the white dress stood. Danielle Reed did not need to speak to command the room, because the room had already belonged to her. She bent down and picked up the wine glass that had been forced into her hand earlier. The dried stain of red wine marked her wrist, like a brand of humiliation. But when she straightened, the crystal caught the light gleaming like a blade of justice, sharp and pure. She set the glass down carefully, then drew a small phone from her clutch. No one dared move. Victoria Whitmore let out a shrill, brittle laugh, trying to recover control. "What are you doing calling a cab or live streaming for pity?" No one answered. The only sounds were the uneven breathing and the rain tapping against the glass walls. Danielle touched the screen lightly. A woman's voice came through the speaker, clear and professional. "Kayla here. All set, Mom." The room jolted. Kayla, her trusted assistant, waiting at the Reed International office just a few blocks away, knew exactly what that meant. Danielle raised the phone to her ear, her voice low, steady, cold as steel. Initiate the lock, effective immediately. Greg Patterson, the manager, frowned in confusion. Brandon scowled, turning to his father. What is she talking about? Victoria laughed sharply. This is ridiculous. Initiate the lock. What does she think? She's in a movie. But Charles Whitmore Sr., a man who had lived long enough to recognize the scent of real power, felt his chest tighten. The way Danielle spoke, it was not jest. It was not performance. It was a command. Through the speaker, Kayla's voice returned calm and precise. Understood, Miss Reed. The Whitmore-Reed merger is now suspended. All accounts are locked pending review. The words echoed across the grand hall, not loud, not dramatic, but their impact struck like a storm. The guests looked at one another, faces drained of color. A man whispered, "Did she just say the $5 billion deal is frozen?" Another replied softly, "That's impossible. Who is she?" Victoria laughed nervously. No, that's absurd. She's bluffing. No one can." But a sharp ping from Charles's phone silenced her. He looked down his face, turning white. On the screen, the message was clear. Transaction on hold. Merger status locked. His hand trembled, the wine glass slipping from his grasp and shattering on the floor. The sound rang through the room like a gunshot announcing collapse. Greg Patterson saw it and gasped. "Oh God, it's real." Ethan Park lowered his camera, nearly whispering, "She really controls the deal." Murmurs rippled through the hall like an undercurrent. A young woman clutched her chest voice, trembling. "My God, she's Danielle Reed, of Reed International, the founder of the hotel group behind the $5 billion merger with Whitmore Capital." The news spread faster than light. In just a few breaths, those who had mocked her understood they had just humiliated the woman who held their future in her hands. Victoria stepped back, eyes wide, voice cracking. No, this can't be father. She's lying, right?" Charles said nothing. He stood frozen, stone-faced lips moving without sound. "Impossible," he whispered, staring at Danielle as though seeing a ghost he had never wanted to meet. Danielle lowered her phone without another word, letting silence devour the room. Then she turned slowly, her eyes sweeping over each face, every person who had laughed, every gaze that had judged her. There was no anger in her eyes, only the cold precision of justice. Finally, her gaze stopped on Greg Patterson, still paralyzed between two worlds. She spoke softly. "You asked if I had an invitation. Now you may want to check the list again." Greg stammered, almost breathless. I didn't know It's all right." Danielle cut him off gently, her tone calm but decisive. "I just want you to remember one thing. Your silence was a choice, and every choice has a cost." Nearby, Mia Torres, the young server, stood with tears in her eyes. She had just witnessed the impossible. The woman they mocked had, with a single command, frozen the Whitmore empire in seconds. Danielle met her gaze and nodded, a faint smile, a thank you unspoken. Mia took a deep breath, feeling something ignite in her chest, not rage, but faith. Faith that dignity, once held firm, could shake the world. Victoria now stood pale, her voice breaking. You can't do that. You can't cancel an entire merger just because of a party," Danielle interrupted with a faint smile. "No, I cancelled it because of truth. Because of people who think power gives them the right to humiliate others without consequence." She stepped forward. Each footstep echoed across the marble floor like the beat of destiny. "You forgot," she said, "that money can buy a ballroom, buy light, buy smiles painted in gold, but it can never buy back dignity once you lose it. Victoria broke into sobs, voice trembling. "You'll regret this." "No," Danielle said. "I've regretted enough by staying silent around people like you. Tonight I'm only correcting that." From within the orchestra, a violin slipped from a musician's hand and hit the floor with a sharp crack. No one dared to pick it up. The entire room stood frozen, as if witnessing an execution carried out in silence. Ethan lowered his camera eyes, glistening. He hadn't expected to feel this moved. "She just turned humiliation into victory," he murmured, and did it with the calm of a monarch. Danielle turned toward the doors. "This party," she said without looking back, "was meant to celebrate our merger. But after what I've heard tonight, I don't feel like celebrating anymore." She stopped at the doorway, her voice low and steady. "Every deal has conditions. Tonight yours just expired." The words echoed through the hall, a verdict, short, cold, and absolute, without a gavel, but powerful enough to make the entire room bow its head. And as the doors opened, the night wind swept in with rain and chill. Everyone realized this was more than a cancelled deal. It was a system being judged, and the one delivering the sentence was the very woman they had mistaken for a servant. The room was silent. The only sound left was the rain tapping against the vast glass windows, steady as the heartbeat of justice. No one dared speak. No one dared move. They only watched the woman in the white dress, the same woman they had mocked minutes ago now, walking through the Langston Grand Hall as if she were the one who had written its fate. Charles Whitmore Sr. stood frozen, the pride gone from his eyes. He still could not believe what had just happened. "You, who did you say you are?" he asked, his voice rough as though he feared the answer himself. Danielle stopped. The chandelier light fell upon her face, tracing her features like marble carved in stillness. She turned toward him, her gaze cold, deep, and steady. "I am Danielle Reed," she said slowly. "Founder and chairwoman of Reed International, the one who negotiated, structured, and signed the $5 billion merger with Whitmore Capital." The words fell into the room like a sonic blast. For a split second, space seemed to tighten, and every breath became audible. A grey-haired woman, a long-time donor to the Whitmore Foundation, whispered, "It can't be. I read about Reed International last week. The article said their CEO was a woman." The man beside her murmured, "It's her. It's really her." Phones lifted across the hall screens, lighting faces pale with shock. A quick search confirmed it. Danielle Reed, the same face, now standing before them, accompanied by headlines that read, "The silent architect of Reed International's rise and the billion-dollar visionary behind the global merger." The room exploded in absolute silence. No one could speak. Brandon Whitmore stepped back, his voice trembling. No way, she can't, she just..." He couldn't finish because, in Danielle's eyes, he saw what words could never deny. She didn't need to prove who she was. She was the proof. Victoria Whitmore staggered, her lips quivering. You're joking. If you're real, why did you come here alone?" Danielle answered softly, her eyes sharp as glass. "Because I wanted to see what kind of people I was partnering with." She took one step forward, her voice low, but every word struck like iron on stone. "And now I know." Ethan Park, still holding his camera, stood motionless. His lens captured everything, the stunned faces, the laughter draining from the Whitmore's lips. "She didn't come to attend a gala," he murmured. "She came to test their character." Greg Patterson, the manager, felt his hands turn cold. In his mind, memories flooded every word he had spoken, every order he had obeyed, every moment he had looked away, each of them now carved into his conscience like a blade. "Miss Reed, he stammered. Danielle cut him off, her voice. "Calm, you don't need to explain. I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed that someone in the service industry could forget the most basic rule: respect." Greg lowered his head. He couldn't meet her eyes. Charles stepped forward, struggling to recover a shred of authority. "Miss Reed," he said, "perhaps we started off on the wrong foot. But let's be rational." Rational Danielle's laugh was soft, but it chilled the air. "You call it rational when you allow your people to humiliate your partner in the middle of a celebration." She stepped closer, her heels echoing on marble like a judge's gavel. "You don't need to pretend to be virtuous. I've seen enough. And I've made my decision." A sharp ping sounded from Charles's phone. He looked down and his face turned grey. The new notification read, "Deal status terminated. Access revoked. Audit in progress." Like falling dominoes, the same notifications began popping up on the phones of executives, lawyers, and investors throughout the hall. Each ping was a death knell for the Whitmore empire. A man shouted in panic, "God, the accounts are being locked. Trading centers are shutting down." Another gasped, "The entire system's frozen. She actually did it." Victoria went pale, her hands shaking, her voice breaking apart. "You can't do this. You'll destroy everything. We'll both lose." Danielle looked at her calm and steady. "No, only one side will. Mine loses money. Yours loses the world's respect." Victoria collapsed into a chair, tears spilling down her cheeks, her lipstick smearing like a mask melting away. Ethan whispered, his camera still recording, "This isn't about money anymore. This is judgment." Near the door, Mia Torres stood with her hands clasped tight. She didn't know whether to cry or smile. The woman she had tried to protect was now protecting her not with words, but with an act so powerful it brought an empire to its knees. Danielle turned to her, her tone softening. "Thank you. Not everyone has the courage to speak when it matters." Mia shook her head, tears streaking her face. "It wasn't courage. It's because you showed me what's worth believing in." The words rippled through the crowd like an unseen quake. Charles looked around for allies, but there were none left. Those who had laughed with him now averted their gaze. Some slipped away quietly. Others bowed their heads ashamed. No one wanted to remain aboard a sinking ship. Danielle slowly lifted a glass of water from the table. "Congratulations, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly. "Tonight you've taught the world the most expensive lesson of all, how to lose everything with a single sentence." She set the glass down gently, yet the sound it made, a sharp click, rang out like the hammer of a judge. Victoria jumped up, screaming in despair. "You think you've won. You cancelled the deal. You'll lose billions." Danielle turned her smile calm enough to frighten. "There are things you can lose and rebuild, but dignity, once lost, no amount of money can buy it back." The Langston Hall sank into the silence of judgment. Ethan turned off his camera and drew a deep breath. She didn't just end a deal. He whispered she ended an era. Mia watched, her eyes shining. She knew she had just witnessed the unimaginable, a woman publicly humiliated, who with only 3 sentences made the world bow its head. As Danielle walked toward the door, the chandeliers cast her reflection across the marble floor, forming a streak of light behind her, the path of someone leaving the battlefield with absolute victory. No one dared stop her. No one dared meet her eyes. Only the sound of rain outside remained steady and cold, washing away the last trace of arrogance left in the room. No more music. No more clinking of glasses. Only the howl of wind against the glass walls and the frantic heartbeat of those who had just lost their world in a single breath. Danielle Reed stood in the middle of the Langston Hall, calm as if she had not just cancelled a $5 billion deal. She lifted her phone and tapped once more. The screen lit up. Kayla's voice came through the speaker, clear and final, like a bell-tolling judgment. Confirmed. Effective immediately. The Whitmore deal is terminated. All accounts and facility access revoked. Legal audit begins tonight. The words rippled through the room, not loud, not rushed, but sharp enough to tear apart the last fragments of the Whitmore family's pride. Charles collapsed into a chair, his face pale, muttering incoherently, No, it can't be." Victoria stood frozen, her glass slipping from her hand, spilling red wine across the floor, red like pride pierced through. Brandon lowered his head, his hands shaking his voice, breaking apart. You've destroyed everything?" Danielle replied softly, her tone free of anger, carrying only the cold certainty of justice. "No, you destroyed everything. I only signed the verdict you wrote yourselves with your own arrogance." Every word she spoke cut through the air like a chisel against stone, each mark permanent and undeniable. Greg Patterson, the hotel manager, swallowed hard, confusion and guilt clouding his eyes. He looked toward Danielle, then bowed his head, voice trembling. I'm sorry, Miss Reed." Danielle gave a slight nod. "Don't apologize to me. Apologize to those you stayed silent for when they were treated the way I was tonight." Greg froze her words, striking him like a mirror held to his conscience, a man who had chosen the side of power instead of what was right. Ethan Park, still holding his camera, turned toward the guests, who now quietly raised their phones. He spoke softly, emotion thick in his voice. "Keep recording. Not to humiliate them, but to remember. This is the moment justice doesn't need, to shout only to stand firm." Mia Torres, the young server, stepped closer to Danielle and whispered, "You just taught them something they never learned in their entire lives." Danielle smiled faintly, her gaze softening. "Not taught Mia. Just reminded them respect is a debt that can never be erased." The grand hall was no longer a ballroom, but a courtroom of truth. Those who once laughed now bowed their heads. Those who once stayed silent now trembled. And at the center stood the woman they once dismissed now, unshaken, radiant, and unbreakable, a living tower of justice. The rain outside kept falling, washing away the illusions that still lingered in the night. The chandelier light reflected across the marble floor, tracing a long path of shimmer, where each step of Danielle Reed left behind a quiet echo, like the mark of a verdict delivered with absolute composure. No one in the room dared to breathe too loudly. Phones were lowered, excuses trapped in throats. Only the silence of truth remained heavier than any music ever played at the Langston. Danielle stopped near the doorway and turned one last time. The light framed her face, outlining eyes calm yet unyielding. Her voice rose not loud, but every word carried a weight that made the entire room bow its head. "You thought I came here to argue to prove that I belong. But no. I came to show that dignity doesn't need validation. It only needs to be preserved. You have money, power, reputation. But tonight you lost the one thing no account can ever buy back: respect." No one answered. Victoria lowered her head mascara, streaking down her cheeks. Brandon turned away. Charles, who had always taken pride in never bowing to anyone, now bowed deeply, and Greg the manager stood frozen eyes, heavy with remorse, lips moving without sound. Mia Torres stepped forward, standing beside Danielle, a silent declaration that truth never stands alone. Danielle nodded gently to the young woman, then turned back toward the crowd. Don't look at me as the victor. I didn't defeat anyone. I only reminded the world that when a person stays silent to protect their dignity, that silence can echo louder than any scream. Ethan Park lowered his camera, his voice breaking softly. She didn't need justice to shout. She made it stand on its own. The grand doors opened. The night wind swept in, carrying Chicago's chill, cleansing the room like a breath of absolution. Danielle's white dress fluttered, her heels tapped against the marble in steady rhythm, the sound beating like the pulse of awakening. She crossed the threshold without looking back. Because justice once seen never needs to prove itself again. That night, no one remembered the Whitmore family's gala. They only remembered the woman who silenced the world with her calm, a woman once dismissed who left that room as the embodiment of dignity and true power. From the perspective of an expert in leadership ethics and corporate culture, the story of Danielle Reed is not merely the triumph of one individual over prejudice, but a reminder that true strength does not come from power or the loudest voice, but from the calm courage to face injustice. When others chose silence out of fear, she chose silence to demonstrate integrity, and that very silence spoke louder than any defense could. In a world where status is too often used to measure worth, Danielle reminds us that respect is not a reward. It is the foundation of character. If you believe that dignity remains the core of human strength, like to share this message, subscribe to follow the journeys where justice is told through the heart, and comment the phrase that embodies your belief, hold your dignity,